Welcome back to the deep dive. We're continuing our section-by-section journey through the MPEP, the Manuals of Patent Examining Procedure. Think of this as building an audio companion for anyone wrestling with U.S. patent law, maybe studying for the patent bar or just trying to get a handle on these procedures.
Exactly. And today we're back in Chapter 1800. That's the big one, covering the Patent Cooperation Treaty, or PCT.
Right, the PCT.
And specifically, we're zeroing in on Section 1868. The title is Correction of Defects in the Demand.
MPP 1868, Correction of Defects in the Demand. Okay, so let's set the stage. What exactly is this demand in the PCT world?
Good place to start. So in PCT language, the demand is basically the applicant's formal request for something called international preliminary examination.
Okay.
It's an optional step that happens after the initial search and opinion. You file this demand if you want a specific authority, the IPEA International Preliminary Examining Authority, to do a deeper examination during that international phase.
Got it. So it's not automatic. It's a specific request, a separate document you file for this extra examination. And our goal today for this deep dive is figuring out what happens when you file that demand, but maybe it's not perfect. It has formal problems.
Precisely. We're looking at how MPP 1868 explains the handling of those defects, and it heavily relies on the PCT's own rules, particularly PCT Rule 60.
Okay, PCT Rule 60. So the whole process kicks off because the demand you filed doesn't meet certain, let's say, formal requirements.
That's right. Rule 60.1 is kind of the trigger. It says if the demand doesn't comply with specific other PCT rules, then action is needed.
And which rules we're talking about? What kind of requirements could be missed?
Well, Rule 60.1 points to a few key ones. Rule 53.1, 53.2, the block from 53.3 through 53.8, and also Rule 55.1.
Okay, that's quite a list. What sort of things do they cover? Like what could actually be defective?
They cover a range of formal things. Correctly identifying the international application it belongs to, the applicant's details, maybe the agent's information, the language used, the actual content of the demand form itself, any necessary declarations. Sometimes fees are mentioned, but 1868 and Rule 60 are really focused on these formal issues.
Right, the paperwork side of things. So let's say the IPEA gets the demand, they look it over, and bam, they find an error based on one of those rules. Is that it? Is the demand just dead in the water?
No, actually, and this is really important, the system has a safeguard. If the IPEA finds a defect under Rule 60.1, they are required to invite the applicant to fix it.
Okay.
They can't just reject it outright for these kinds of formal defects.
An invitation to correct. Sounds polite. What does that look like? And crucially, how much time do you get?
The invitation will spell out exactly what the problem is. You missed a signature here, or this section is incomplete, and it will give you a specific time limit to make the correction.
Is there a standard time limit? Or does it vary wildly?
PCT Rule 60.1 sets a minimum. It says the time limit fixed in that invitation cannot be less than 1 month.
Okay, at least a month.
Yes, calculated from the date you, the applicant, actually receive that notification. So you're guaranteed that minimum could be longer, but at least a month.
A month. Okay, that sounds somewhat reasonable on paper. But, life happens. Mail gets slow. People are on vacation. What are the real stakes here? What happens if you do correct it, but maybe it arrives like a day late? This feels like where things could get serious.
This is absolutely critical, and MP 1868, drawing from Rule 60.1, lays out the consequences very clearly. Let's take the best case scenario first. You get the invitation, you fix the problem, and the IPE receives your correction within the time limit they gave you.
Okay, perfect world. You meet the deadline. What's the effect on the demand's filing date?
So if the correction arrives on time, and this isn't important, and the original demand, even with its defect, was good enough for the IPEA to figure out which international application it was for.
Ah, so they had to at least know which case file it belonged to.
Exactly. That's sort of a baseline. If both those conditions are met, timely correction, identifiable original demand, then the filing date of the demand is treated as the original date it was received.
Wow, okay. So it's like the mistake never happened, procedurally speaking. You get to keep that original date.
Correct. It's as if it was filed correctly from day one.
And why is keeping that specific date for the demand so important? It's not the main filing date of the whole application, right?
Right. It doesn't change the international filing date, which sets your priority, but the date the demand is considered filed impacts the timing of the international preliminary examination itself.
Okay.
And that timing can influence when the clock starts for certain actions, potentially when you enter the national phase in different countries. And critically, it could subtly shift the landscape of what prior art is considered relevant against your claims later on, particularly in those national phases.
Ah, I see. So pushing that demand date later, even by a bit, because of a late correction, might mean some piece of prior art that was published after your original demand date, but before the corrected date suddenly becomes relevant.
That's the potential risk, yes. It's about maintaining the procedural sequence and timeline as intended. So preserving that original demand date is definitely preferable.
Makes sense. So that's the good outcome. What's the consequence then if the correction arrives after the deadline? You fixed it, but you were late.
That's the scenario under Rule 60.1c. If the correction is received by the IPEA after the time limit expires, the filing date of the demand changes.
Changes to what?
It becomes the date the IPEA actually received the necessary correction, not the original date anymore.
Ouch. So your request for examination is now officially dated later. And like you just said, that could potentially bring in later published prior art during national stages.
That's the implication. The procedural date shifts forward in time because of the delay in correction.
Okay, and what about the worst case scenario? What if you just ignore the invitation? Or maybe the original demand was so messed up they couldn't even tell which application it was for?
If no correction is received within the time limit, or if that fundamental identification requirement wasn't met initially and isn't fixed in time, then the demand is treated as if it had never been submitted at all.
Wow, just gone, poof.
Essentially, yes. Your request for that optional international preliminary examination just vanishes from the record. You lose the chance to have that examination phase entirely based on that demand.
That's harsh. Okay, so let me recap the stakes real quick. Get the correction in on time and make sure the original was identifiable. You keep the original demand date. File the correction late. The demand date shifts to when the correction arrives. File no timely correction. It's like you never filed the demand at all.
That captures the three main outcomes perfectly. It's all about the timing of that correction.
Let's make this a bit more real. The source material gives examples. You mentioned signatures earlier. How does that work?
Yeah, a missing signature is a pretty common formal defect. The MPP notes that signing the demand is one way an agent can be appointed under Rule 90.4a. So if you file the demand, but oops, the required signature is missing. But the demand still clearly identifies the international application, the IPEA must send you that invitation asking you to provide the signature.
And if you send the signature back within the deadline, say within that month or whatever they gave you,
then, because the original was identifiable and the correction was timely, the IPEA accepts the original date the defective demand was received as the official filing date for the demand.
Okay, perfect illustration of the timely correction saves the date rule. What about other issues? The outline mentioned amendments.
Right, this is slightly different, governed by Rule 69.10e, but related. Sometimes when you file the demand, you might indicate that you're submitting amendments to the claims or description under Article 34 amendments, specifically for this preliminary examination phase. But maybe you mention them on the demand form, but you don't actually include the amendments with the demand filing itself.
So the demand says, see amendments, but where are they?
Exactly. In that case, the IPEA uses a similar process. They'll invite the applicant to furnish the missing amendments. If you provide them within the time limit they set, then the examination proceeds considering those amendments.
That seems less like a defect in the demand form itself and more like missing accompanying documents.
It is slightly different, yeah. But the mechanism and invitation from the IPEA to provide something missing with a deadline, it's a common procedural tool in the PCT system, and this one is obviously closely linked to the demand process.
Makes sense. What about cases with lots of applicants? You often have multiple inventors, maybe different companies involved. Does everyone need to sign the demand? That sounds like a logistical nightmare.
Ah, good point. And the rules offer some relief here. The MPP points to PCT Rule 53.4, which explicitly allows the demand to identify or be signed by just one of the applicants.
Oh, really? Just one?
Yes, provided the applicant is actually qualified to file the demand in the first place, meaning they meet the residency or nationality requirements for the chosen IPEA. But you don't need every single name or signature.
That's incredibly practical, especially if you have like 10 inventors. Getting one qualified signature is much easier.
Definitely streamlines things. Rule 53.4 makes it much simpler to comply with the formal requirements in those multi-applicant situations.
Okay, so we've got the applicant trying to file, the IPEA checking for defects and inviting corrections. What about the main PCT office, the International Bureau or IB? Do they play a part in this defect correction?
They can, yes. The IB handles a lot of the initial processing and communication. They might actually be the first ones to spot a formal defect in the demand, perhaps when they receive a copy.
And if they spot it?
If the IB identifies a defect, they'll typically notify the IPEA about it. But it's still the IPEA that holds the responsibility under Rule 60 to actually issue the invitation to correct to the applicant and manage that whole correction process.
So the IB might flag it, but the IPEA is the one who officially tells the applicant, hey, you need to fix this, and handles the response.
That's the standard workflow, yes. The IPEA owns the Rule 60 correction procedure.
Okay. So pulling all this together then, thinking about our listener, maybe they're managing PCT applications, maybe they're studying this stuff. What's the big takeaway from understanding MPP 1868 and PCT Rule 60?
I think there are two main things. First, it really highlights the need for, well, carefulness, meticulous preparation when you're putting that demand together. Double-checking against the requirements in Rule 53 and the others before you file can save you a ton of potential trouble.
Right. Aim for perfection the first time. But what's the second point, assuming maybe perfection doesn't happen?
Then the second point is all about response time. If you do get that invitation to correct from the IPEA, you absolutely need systems in place to catch it, understand it, and act on it fast. Making sure that correction physically gets received by the IPEA before that deadline expires is, frankly, non-negotiable if you want to avoid negative consequences. That diligence is just critical during the international phase.
And zooming out, why does nailing this seemingly small procedural step matter for the overall goal of getting patents in different countries?
Because failure here can disrupt the whole process. If your demand is treated as never submitted because you didn't correct a defect, you lose that examination opportunity. If the date gets pushed back significantly due to a late correction, it could, as we discussed, potentially alter the prior art landscape when you eventually enter the national phase in various countries. It's about maintaining the procedural validity and planned timeline for your international application across all those jurisdictions you might enter later. You don't want administrative slips to potentially weaken your position.
It really drives home how these procedural rules, even for something like a signature on a form, aren't just bureaucratic hoops. They have real teeth and can impact the substance down the line.
Absolutely. The rules create predictability and order, and not following them or not fixing errors promptly when invited carries defined penalties.
So the core message from MPP 1868 seems to be, get the demand right if you can. But if you mess up and the IPEA calls you on it, drop everything and fix it before that deadline hits.
Treat that invitation to correct like a high priority alert. Your promptness directly impacts the fate of your demand and potentially aspects of future examination.
Okay, let's leave our listeners as a final thought, building on that idea of the shifting date. Imagine this. You file your demand for a really cutting-edge invention, but it has a formal defect, maybe that missing signature. A few weeks go by after you filed it, but before your correction actually lands back at the IPEA, in that little window, maybe a competitor publishes something or launches a related product, something that could be prior art. Now, if your correction arrives late and Rule 60.1c kicks in, shifting your demand's effective date forward past that competitor's publication, how might that simple procedural delay suddenly make your life much harder when your application hits national examination? What damage could that shifted date do regarding the prior art the examiner can now use against you?
It's a scenario that really underscores why meeting that correction deadline is so much more than just checking a box. It can have tangible consequences.
Indeed. Something to think about. And just before we wrap up, a quick disclaimer. Remember, this deep dive is based on our reading of the MPEP and related materials generated with the help of AI tools. It's for educational and informational purposes. It's not legal advice. For specific guidance, always consult the official MPEP documentation or a qualified patent practitioner.
Absolutely.
Hey.
And a special thank you to Mike Shepard, the creative director who orchestrated this entire MPEP audio series project.
Yes, thank you, Mike. And thank you for joining us for this exploration of MPP Section 1868. We'll be back soon with another deep dive into the Manual of Patent Examining Procedure.